Lawyer humiliates a rancher in court, but he says something that shakes her. Jessica Reynolds was about to achieve the greatest triumph of her career as a lawyer. In front of her, sitting in the witness stand, an older man with a simple appearance, weathered by time, awaited the questioning that could determine the fate of his land. It was then that she noticed the rancher, Frank Miller, staring at her in a strangely familiar way that made her hesitate for a moment before beginning her argument. In the courtroom in Sacramento, in the heart of New York City, the silence was absolute as Jessica adjusted the documents on the table. "Mr. Miller, you claim this property has belonged to your family for 3 generations, correct?" she asked, with the firm voice she had honed over years of practice. "Yes, ma'am. My grandfather bought that land in 1932, passed it to my father, who left it to me," replied the rancher, adjusting the worn-out cap he wore even in the formal setting of the courtroom. Jessica smiled slightly, the kind of smile her colleagues at the firm knew well, the prelude to a precise attack. "And do you have the original documentation for that purchase?" The old rancher shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We had a flood in 1964 that damaged many papers, but I have the more recent records." "Interesting," Jessica continued, walking confidently through the courtroom, "because my clients, Horizon Development, have documents indicating irregularities in the property's boundaries since 1958. A murmur spread through the room as she displayed copies of old maps on the central projector. Jessica was only 35, but her reputation was solid. The daughter of Margaret Reynolds, one of the first women to excel in corporate law in the United States, she followed in her mother's footsteps at the prestigious firm Reynolds and Associates. "What are you implying?" asked the rancher, his voice trembling with indignation. "That my family stole that land?" "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Miller. I'm presenting documented facts," Jessica replied, with calculated coldness. "These maps clearly show that a significant portion of the land you claim originally belonged to Spring Valley Ranch, which was later acquired by the founders of Horizon Development." Judge Robert Simmons watched attentively as Jessica continued her meticulous presentation. The case had gained notoriety in the region, a powerful developer seeking land for a major project, blocked by a single owner who refused to sell. Horizon Development has already offered Mr. Miller financial compensation well above market value, Jessica continued, now addressing the judge. "An extremely generous offer that would allow the defendant to purchase equivalent property anywhere in the state and still have a considerable financial reserve." The rancher's lawyer, Mr. Mark Henderson, a middle-aged man with limited resources, compared to Jessica's team, stood to object. "Your Honor, my client isn't questioning the offer. The issue here is that this land is not for sale at any price." Jessica rolled her eyes discreetly before turning back to the rancher. "Mr. Miller, are you aware that your land is the only obstacle to a development that will bring over 3,000 jobs to the region?" Frank Miller straightened in his chair, his tired eyes meeting hers with unsettling intensity. "With all due respect, ma'am, that land isn't just a piece of dirt to me. My whole life is there. Sentimentality isn't a legal argument." "Mr. Miller," Jessica countered, noticing some disapproving glances in the room. "Let's stick to the facts. Do you recognize this document?" She showed a property expansion authorization dated 1965, signed by Frank Miller's father. "This document shows your father requested permission to expand the cultivable area beyond the original property boundaries, an expansion that, according to our investigation, matches exactly the disputed area." The rancher seemed confused as he examined the paper. "I've never seen this before. My father handled these matters." "Convenient, don't you think?" Jessica smiled ironically. "You're claiming ownership of a property with partially lost documentation due to a flood, and whose boundaries were expanded under questionable circumstances." The rancher's lawyer protested again, but Jessica continued her argument, presenting more documents, charts, and testimonies from land survey experts. Her strategy was clear: to completely discredit the legitimacy of the land ownership. After nearly an hour of relentless questioning, the rancher appeared visibly shaken. Jessica knew she was winning and allowed herself a moment of personal satisfaction. Winning this case would surely position her as a candidate for senior partner at the firm, a goal she'd had since law school. "One final question, Mr. Miller," said Jessica, stepping closer to the stand. "Why at 70 years old with no known heirs, do you cling so stubbornly to a property you can no longer properly manage?" A heavy silence filled the room. The rancher's lawyer tried to intervene, but Frank Miller gestured for him to sit. "So you ask about heirs," he said slowly, his voice gaining unexpected strength. "I suppose it's time to talk about that." Jessica felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. "This isn't relevant to the case," she tried to interrupt, but the judge allowed the rancher to continue. 35 years ago, I met a young law student vacationing in the area," he began, his eyes never leaving Jessica's. "Her name was Margaret Thompson at the time." Jessica paled. Thompson was her mother's maiden name. "This is absurd. We're straying from the matter," she protested, but her voice had lost its usual firmness. "We had a brief but intense romance," the rancher continued, ignoring her objections. "She returned to New York City to finish school. I never saw her again, but months later, I received a letter." Jessica's legs weakened, and she subtly steadied herself against the table. "Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to divert attention," she argued, but her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. The judge, noticing the sudden shift in the lawyer's demeanor, leaned forward with renewed interest. "Proceed, Mr. Miller." The rancher pulled a small golden crescent-shaped locket from the inner pocket of his worn jacket. "Margaret sent me this with the letter. She said she was pregnant but didn't want me in her life or the child's, that she had big plans for her future, and I wasn't part of them." Jessica's blood ran cold. She knew that locket, an identical replica, was among her mother's most treasured possessions, kept in a small blue velvet box. "The baby was due the following February," the rancher continued. "I respected her decision, heartbroken as I was, but I never stopped thinking about that child, so I planted a purple magnolia on the day I calculated would be the birth, and another, every birthday." Some in the audience began making connections, glancing between Jessica and the rancher, the shape of their eyes, certain gestures. "I have 35 purple magnolias lined up at the entrance of my property," he concluded, looking directly at Jessica. "To the daughter I never knew, but always loved from afar." Jessica was in shock. Her birth date, February 15th. Her mother had always been evasive about her father's identity, claiming it had been a brief relationship with a man who died before she was born. The purple magnolia photographs her mother kept religiously. The occasional remarks about how Jessica had inherited his eyes. The entire courtroom waited in absolute silence for her reaction. "I request a recess, Your Honor," she managed to say at last, her voice barely audible. The judge, visibly struck by the unexpected turn, agreed immediately. "This court will recess for 1 hour. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story." Jessica practically ran to the private room reserved for attorneys, her hands shaking as she dialed her mother's number. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want the absolute truth," she said as soon as Margaret answered. "Jessica, what's wrong? Are you okay?" The worry was clear in her mother's voice. "Who is my father?" A heavy silence settled over the line. "Why are you asking this now? We're in the middle of the Horizon development case." "Mom," Jessica's voice came out louder than she intended. "I'm in a courtroom with a 70-year-old rancher named Frank Miller, who just showed me a locket identical to yours and said he had an affair with a law student named Margaret Thompson 35 years ago." The sound of something shattering on the other end was followed by muffled sobs. "My God, he's alive," Margaret finally whispered. Jessica felt the world spin around her, bracing herself against the wall to keep from falling. "You told me my father was dead." I thought it would be better that way," Margaret replied between sobs. "He was just a simple rancher, Jessica. My family would never have accepted it. I had plans, ambitions." "So it's true?" Jessica pressed, tears now streaming freely down her face. Yes, Margaret finally answered. Frank Miller is your father. Jessica hung up without saying goodbye, her mind in turmoil. Her entire life, her identity, was being rewritten in that moment. She was the daughter of a country rancher, the same man she had been publicly humiliating in court to favor a powerful development company. For the rest of the recess, Jessica remained alone, wrestling with memories and questions. The purple magnolias in her mother's photographs. The mysterious trips Margaret took to the countryside every February, supposedly to visit an elderly aunt. It all made terrible sense now. When the court reconvened, the silence was deafening. Every eye was fixed on Jessica as she entered the dear room, visibly shaken but with a new determination in her gaze. Your Honor, she began, her voice surprisingly steady. I request permission to make a statement. The judge nodded, intrigued by the shift in her demeanor. I hereby declare my ethical disqualification from continuing to represent Horizon Development in this case, she announced, causing an immediate stir in the room. A conflict of interest prevents me from proceeding. The company's representative, seated in the front row, stood up in outrage. This is absurd. We can't switch attorneys at this stage. The judge called for order with a strike of the gavel. Ms. Reynolds, could you explain the nature of this conflict? Jessica took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Frank Miller before answering. Your Honor, I believe I share a familial relationship with the defendant that ethically bars me from continuing. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and the judge had to strike the gavel again. Given these extraordinary circumstances, this court declares a 2-week postponement to allow Horizon Development to reorganize its legal representation. The documents presented today will remain on record. As the session concluded, Jessica remained motionless in her seat, unable to meet the curious gazes around her. Her career, carefully built over the years, might be crumbling, but a strange sense of relief began to rise in her chest. Frank Miller stood up slowly, still holding the locket. When their eyes met again, there was no triumph in his gaze, only deep, restrained emotion. Jessica quickly exited the courthouse through the back, avoiding the press already gathered at the main entrance. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing, calls from her mother, the office, the construction company, but she ignored them all. She drove aimlessly for hours along the back roads of upstate New York, trying to process the turn her life had taken. When she finally stopped, it was dusk, and she found herself in front of a simple wooden gate with a weathered sign, Hope Farmstead. In the distance, even in the dim twilight, she could see a row of trees she recognized as magnolias, 35 of them perfectly aligned. With her heart racing, Jessica stepped out of the car and approached the gate. There was no doorbell, just an old bell hanging from a post. She hesitated a moment before ringing it, the sharp sound echoing across the quiet property. A few minutes later, a light turned on in the modest house in the distance, and the silhouette of Frank Miller appeared, walking slowly toward her. I thought you might come, he said simply as he opened the gate. Jessica was speechless. All the questions she had rehearsed during the drive now seemed inadequate. Why did you never reach out, was all she managed to say. The old rancher sighed deeply. Your mother made it clear she didn't want me in your lives. I thought I was respecting her wishes. But you knew who I was today in court, didn't you? He nodded slowly. The moment you walked into that room. You have your mother's eyes, but the way you tilt your head when you're thinking, that you got from me. The tears Jessica had held back for hours finally spilled over. My whole life has been a lie. No, he replied gently. Your mother did what she thought was best for you. Margaret was always determined in her goals. She told me you had died. Pain crossed the old rancher's weathered face. In a way, a part of me did when she left, he answered with a sad smile. But another part was born when I learned I'd have a daughter. That's why I never sold this land, no matter the offers over the years. I always hoped one day you'd learn the truth and come here. Jessica looked at the row of purple magnolias, each representing a year of her life, each planted by a father she never knew, but who never stopped thinking of her. Would you like to come inside? Frank invited, gesturing toward the house. It's nothing as fancy as you're used to, but the coffee's good. For the first time that day, Jessica smiled genuinely. I'd love to. The house was exactly as Jessica imagined, simple, warm, with well-kept antique furniture and photographs everywhere. One entire wall was dedicated to the purple magnolias, one for each year, showing how they grew and bloomed over time. Every February I took a new photo, Frank explained as he poured coffee into old porcelain mugs. It was my way of keeping up with your growth, even from afar. Jessica studied the images with a lump in her throat. My mother had a few, photos of purple magnolias tucked away. I never understood why. Frank smiled melancholically. She used to come here, you know. Once a year, usually around her birthday. She'd stay in the car parked on the road, watching the property from afar. Sometimes I thought I should go talk to her, but I always respected our agreement. She never told me, whispered Jessica, absorbing this new revelation. Margaret was always a woman of firm decisions, he remarked, lowering himself with difficulty into a worn armchair. When we met, she was vacationing with college friends at a neighboring ranch. I was already 35, she was just 20. It was an unlikely love, but intense. Jessica sat facing him, hanging on every word, every detail of the story she'd never known. When she found out she was pregnant, she'd already returned to New York City. She wrote me a letter explaining she had big ambitions in her legal career, that her family had expectations, that a rancher from the countryside didn't fit into her plans. She asked me never to contact her, that it would be better for the child to grow up without that complication. And you just accepted that? Jessica asked, a hint of indignation in her voice. Frank let out a deep sigh. I loved her enough to respect her decision, even if it destroyed me inside. And I was afraid that if I pushed, she might... He stopped, unable to finish. Have an abortion, Jessica completed, understanding the depth of his fear. He nodded sadly. So I let her go with the promise that I'd take care of that child as best I could. And I prayed every day that I might meet my daughter someday. The silence that followed was filled only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the occasional chirping of crickets outside. What happens now? Jessica finally asked, feeling strangely like a lost child despite her 35 years and all her usual professional confidence. That depends on you, Frank replied gently. I've already gotten more than I hoped for, just by talking to you now. Jessica felt a wave of emotion she couldn't name. Anger over the lie that had lasted her whole life, sadness for the lost years, relief at finally knowing her true origin, maybe a little of everything. I probably lost my job today, she remarked, with a humorless laugh. The firm belongs to my mother's family. They won't forgive what I did in court. You did what was right, he said firmly. Not everyone has that courage. Courage? She questioned. I don't know if it was courage or shock. A revelation like that, in the middle of a courtroom, most people would have pretended not to, hear and carried on with the case. Jessica considered this for a moment and realized she could never have done that. Even before confirming the truth with her mother, something inside her already knew, already recognized this man as part of herself. What will happen to your land now, she asked, suddenly remembering the original reason they'd ended up in this situation. They'll come back with another lawyer, of course, Frank replied, without apparent concern. And they'll keep trying to, convince or force me to sell, but now I have an even greater reason to resist. The magnolias, Jessica understood. Each one represents a year of your life, he confirmed, emotional. They're my connection to you. I couldn't bear to see them, destroyed to make way for some luxury development. Jessica stood and walked to the window, observing the dark outlines of trees against the starry night sky. I could help, she said suddenly, turning to face him. I'm a good lawyer, you know. It's not just because of the family name. A smile brightened Frank's aged face. I never doubted that. You gave me quite the challenge in court today. Jessica smiled too, feeling an unexpected connection with this man who was a stranger yet so familiar. I know all the strategies the development company will use. I could work with your current lawyer. Frank seemed too moved to respond immediately. You would do that? After everything? Especially after everything, she replied with conviction. That night, Jessica didn't return to New York City. For the first time in many years, she casually called to cancel her next-day commitments, something the perfectionist Jessica of before would never have done. They talked late into the night, filling in the gaps of 35 years apart, discovering similarities that transcended distance and time. The next morning, Jessica woke up in the guest room of the simple house, feeling strangely at peace, despite the turmoil her life had become. When she stepped onto the porch, she found Frank watching the sunrise over the magnolias. "Good morning," he greeted her, offering a mug of coffee. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," she answered honestly. "This place has a special energy." "It's a simple life, but a good one," he said with evident pride. "Would you like to see the property?" Over the next few hours, Frank showed Jessica every corner of the farmstead that could have been part of her childhood. The creek where he fished on Sundays, the hill with the most beautiful sunset views in the area, the orchard with fruit trees of every kind, and finally, the row of purple magnolias. "The first one," he said, stopping in front of the oldest and tallest tree, "I planted when I calculated it would be around your birth date. February 15th, right?" Jessica nodded, moved that he knew her birthday. "Every year on the same day, I planted a new one," he continued, walking slowly down the row. "And I cared for each one as if it were you." When they reached the 35th magnolia, the newest one, still small compared to the others, Frank stopped. "This one was planted this February. I never imagined that just a few months later, I'd be showing it to you." Jessica couldn't hold back the tears she'd been fighting for so long. "Why purple magnolias?" she asked when she finally found her voice. "Your mother loved purple magnolias," he answered with a nostalgic smile. "She said they were like life. They spend most of their time quietly unnoticed, but when they bloom, it's impossible to ignore them. I remember she wanted our daughter to be like that, strong, resilient, but also able to blossom and show her full beauty when the time was right." Jessica had never heard this comparison before, but it made perfect sense. Margaret had always encouraged her to be discreet, to work quietly until the right moment to shine. "They usually bloom in August," Frank added. "If you'd like, you can come back to see them. It's a sight worth waiting for." "I'll come back," Jessica promised. "Many times." Back at the house, as they drank coffee on the porch, Jessica's phone rang again. This time she answered. "Hello? Jessica Reynolds, have you completely lost your mind?" Her mother's furious voice crackled through the line. "The entire office is in chaos. The developers are threatening to sue for breach of contract, and you just disappear?" "I'm at Hope Farmstead, Mum," she replied calmly, "talking to my father." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. "Jessica, I can explain." "You don't need to explain right now, Mum. I've already figured out a lot. I'm just calling to say I won't be back at the office today. Probably not tomorrow either." "What are you planning to do?" Margaret asked, her tone more worried than angry now. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know I can't just go on like nothing happened." Another silence, this one more thoughtful. "Is he doing okay?" Margaret finally asked, her voice slightly choked up. Jessica looked at Frank, who was gazing at the horizon with a serene expression. "Yes, he's fine, and I think he'd be happy to talk to you, if you'd like." After ending the call, Jessica remained silent for a while, contemplating the many changes unfolding in her life. "Is your mother coming?" Frank asked, trying not to sound anxious. "She said she needs time," Jessica replied honestly, "but she didn't rule it out." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and, especially, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now back to the story. In the days that followed, Jessica immersed herself in a reality completely different from the hectic life she'd led in New York City. She woke to birdsong, spent her days helping Frank with simple farm tasks, and studied the case documents with fresh eyes. The law firm called repeatedly, escalating from requests for her immediate return to veiled threats, and finally, a formal termination notice. Horizon Development also reached out through their new legal representative, hinting at possible confidentiality breach claims. Jessica took it all with a calm that surprised even herself. The truth was, She no longer recognized the ruthless professional she'd been just days before. "Don't worry about me," Frank said when she shared her concerns about her career. "I don't want to be responsible for ruining your future." "You haven't ruined anything," she replied firmly. "If anything, you've helped me see clearly the path I was on." On the afternoon of the 5th day, as they reviewed old documents Frank had kept about the property, they heard a car approaching. Through the window, Jessica immediately recognized her mother's silver Mercedes. "She came," she whispered, her heart racing. Frank paled, instinctively smoothing his simple shirt. "Would you rather speak with her alone first?" he offered. Jessica shook her head. "I think we've waited long enough for this." Margaret Reynolds was as elegant as ever, even in more casual attire than her usual suits. At 55, she still carried the impeccable posture and determined expression that had taken her to the top of her profession. But today, there was something different in her eyes, a rare vulnerability. "Mom," Jessica greeted, opening the door before Margaret could knock. "Daughter," she replied, hugging her briefly before looking past her at the man standing at a respectful distance. "Frank." "Margaret." The farmer's voice was hoarse with emotion. "You look exactly as I remember." A sad smile touched Margaret's lips. "You haven't changed as much as time would suggest." The initial meeting was tense, filled with carefully chosen words. Sitting in the simple living room with untouched cups of coffee, the three of them seemed like uncertain actors unsure of their cues. "Why now?" Margaret finally asked, breaking an especially uncomfortable silence. "After all these years respecting our agreement, why reveal everything in open court?" Frank seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "It was never my intention. Believe me, Margaret, I didn't know Jessica was the attorney on the case until I saw her in that courtroom. When I realized who she was, it felt like fate had finally given me the chance I'd waited 35 years for." "You could have stayed silent," Margaret insisted, a hint of accusation in her voice. "And let my own daughter strip me of the land where I planted 35 purple magnolias in her honor," he countered, without hostility but with firmness. "I couldn't allow this." Jessica watched the exchange with a surreal feeling, as if she were watching a movie about her own life. "You two need to stop talking like I'm not here," she finally interjected. "This is my story too, you know." Both turned to her, momentarily ashamed. "You're right, darling," conceded Margaret, "and you have every right to be angry with me." "I'm not angry, Mom," Jessica replied honestly. "I'm disappointed to have lived a lie for so long, but I'm also trying to understand your reasons." Margaret took a deep breath, seeming finally ready for the conversation she'd avoided for decades. "I was 20, Jessica, in my 3rd year of law school, with a promising career ahead and a traditional family that had high expectations for me. I met Frank during my summer vacation. It was like a hurricane," he added with a distant look. 2 weeks that felt like a lifetime. "When I found out I was pregnant, I'd already returned to New York City," Margaret continued. "My parents would have disowned me if they'd known I was expecting a child with a—" She stopped, realizing what she was about to say. "With a simple rancher," Frank finished without bitterness. "You can say it, Margaret. I always knew your family would consider me inadequate. I was young, ambitious, and scared," she admitted. "I chose the path that seemed safest for me and the child I was carrying." "By lying about my father's death?" Jessica asked, unable to hide the hurt in her voice. Margaret lowered her eyes. "That lie came later. At first, I just told my family I'd had a brief relationship with an exchange student who'd returned to his country. Over time, when you started asking questions, it seemed simpler to say he'd passed away than to explain the complexity of the situation." "Did you ever consider including me in her life?" Frank asked directly. Margaret held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Many times, especially when she was little and asked about her father. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to undo the lie." "Is that why you came here every year?" Jessica questioned. "To see the magnolias?" An unexpected blush colored Margaret's cheeks. "At first, I came to make sure Frank was respecting our agreement to keep his distance. Later, I think I came because it was the only connection I allowed myself to have with this part of my life I'd left behind. I always knew when you were nearby, Frank confessed. The same car model, always parked in the same spot on the road. You saw me? Margaret asked, surprised. Every year, he confirmed. I never approached because I'd promised I wouldn't, but I treasured every glimpse. A heavy silence filled with unspoken emotions settled in the room. Jessica watched them both, realizing for the first time that what was between them had never been fully resolved, never truly ended. What happens now? She asked, repeating the same question she'd asked Frank days earlier. Margaret looked at her, then at Frank, and finally back at her daughter. I don't know, darling. It all depends on what you want. What I want, Jessica repeated, a trace of bitterness in her voice. I want to recover 35 lost years. I want to understand who I really am. I want... She stopped, unable to continue, tears finally overcoming her resistance. It was Frank who stood first, approaching hesitantly before pulling her into an awkward but sincere embrace. Margaret joined them moments later, and for the first time in her life, Jessica was held by both her parents at once. We still have time, Frank whispered. Maybe not 35 years, but we have time. When emotions had settled, the three sat down again, now with a new atmosphere hanging between them. Not exactly comfortable, but honest, perhaps for the first time. There's one thing I still don't understand, said Jessica, wiping away the last of her tears. If you knew my mother came here every year, why did you never try to reach out? To me through her? Frank exchanged a quick glance with Margaret before answering. There was one time he began hesitating. I intercepted a letter, Margaret confessed, surprising Jessica. When you were about 10, Frank left an envelope on my windshield asking for news about you, wondering if he could at least see a photograph. And you never told me, Jessica concluded, the disappointment clear in her voice. At that time you were already a bright young girl following in the family's footsteps-in-law. I was afraid it might confuse you, pull you away from the path you were carving so well. Margaret explained, without trying to fully justify her actions. That wasn't your decision to make, Mom. You're right, Margaret agreed, to both their surprise. I've made many mistakes, Jessica, mistakes I thought were the right thing at the time. All I can ask is that you try to understand, even if you can't forgive. The rest of the afternoon passed in lighter conversation, sharing stories and memories. Margaret brought out photos of Jessica growing up, first day of school, high school graduation, starting law school, and Frank absorbed each image like a starving man. As the sun began to set, Margaret announced she needed to return to New York City. Are you coming with me? She asked Jessica, no pressure in her voice. I'll stay a few more days, Jessica replied. There's still so much to learn here. Margaret nodded in understanding. Frank, she said, turning to the rancher, before leaving. Thank you for everything, for the magnolias, for respecting my decision even though it was so painful for you, and most of all for being patient enough for this moment to come. Every day of waiting was worth it, he replied simply. After Margaret's departure, Jessica and Frank sat on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the sky. You know, what's funny, she remarked, I spent my whole life trying to impress a family that isn't even fully mine. The Reynolds are your family, Jessica, Frank corrected gently, just as I am. We don't have to exclude one to accept the other. She reflected on his words, letting the simple wisdom of this man sink in. The firm officially let me go today, she revealed. I got the email while you two were talking in the kitchen. Frank frowned, concerned. What will you do now? An unexpected smile lit up Jessica's face. I'm thinking of starting my own practice, specializing in agricultural law, maybe. Defending small landowners against big corporations. The pride in Frank's eyes was impossible to hide. You'd be extraordinary at that. Actually, she continued, excited by the idea taking shape as she spoke, I could start with your case. I know all the weak points in the developer's argument. You'd really do that? Not only would I do it, but it'd be an honor, she replied with conviction, considering my first client would be my own father. That last word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. It was the first time Jessica had called him that, and the impact was visible on Frank's moved expression. In the weeks that followed, Jessica split her time between the farmstead and the city. She rented a small office in Sacramento, hired her freshly graduated secretary, and began building her new career. Margaret, after the initial emotional storm, surprised everyone by offering financial help for her daughter's new venture, an offer Jessica accepted on the condition that it be treated as a professional loan, not maternal support. The case against the development company took a new turn. Jessica, now representing Frank, uncovered irregularities in the project's environmental licensing process and flaws in the traffic impact study the company had submitted. They never expected someone with insider knowledge of their operations to be on the other side, she remarked to Frank after a particularly favorable hearing. The local press, which had initially treated the case as just another clash between progress and tradition, began reporting the incredible personal story behind the legal battle. The lawyer who discovered in court that the defendant was her biological father and switched sides to defend him. "I don't like this publicity," Frank admitted after seeing his photo in the local paper. "Neither do I," Jessica agreed. "But there's an upside. Other small landowners with similar issues are reaching out to me. It seems I've accidentally found my niche." Her new office, modest but functional, started attracting clients, mostly family farmers and small rural landowners pressured by big developments. Jessica found she genuinely enjoyed working with these people, so different from the suited executives she used to represent. In August, as promised, Jessica returned to the farmstead to see the magnolias bloom. The explosion of purple flowers, lined up in a perfect row representing each year of her life, was breathtaking. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," she said, moved as she walked alongside Frank among the trees. "Every year I took photos and had 2 copies developed," he shared. "One stayed with me and the other you sent to my mother," Jessica finished, finally understanding. Frank nodded. "Even though I couldn't be present in your life, I wanted her to know I never forgot, that I always thought of you." That afternoon, as they drank coffee on the porch, watching the purple flowers in the distance, Frank mentioned something he had kept to himself until then. "There's something I want to show you," he said, rising with some difficulty. "Come with me." Jessica followed him to a small back room in the house that served as a makeshift office. From a locked drawer, Frank pulled out a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. "What's this?" she asked, curious. "Letters," he replied, handing her the stack. "One for each of your birthdays from the day you were born. I never had the courage to send them, but I never stopped writing them." With trembling hands, Jessica untied the ribbon and picked up the first envelope. Dated February 15, 1990, it contained a handwritten letter on plain paper. "My daughter, today you turn 1 year old. I don't know what you look like, if you've started walking yet, if you smile easily or are more serious. I don't know the color of your eyes or whether you take after me or your mother more, but I know that somewhere you're growing up. And that's enough to make me the happiest man in the world. I planted a purple magnolia for you today. When it blooms, it'll be the most beautiful tree on this property. I promise to care for it the way I wish I could care for you. Your father, who loves you even without knowing you, Frank." Tears streamed freely down Jessica's face as she read. There were 35 similar letters, each recounting a bit of what happened in Frank's life that year, always mentioning the corresponding magnolia, and imagining what his daughter might be like at that age. "You wrote all these letters without knowing if I'd ever read them. Writing to you was my way of feeling like we still had a connection," he explained. "On the hardest days, it was what kept me going." Jessica Reynolds clutched the bundle of letters to her chest, a new understanding of this simple man's sacrifice and love washing over her. "Thank you for not giving up," she whispered, "for waiting all these years." "I'd wait another 35 if I had to," he replied simply. By the end of that week, as she prepared to return temporarily to Sacramento for a series of hearings, Jessica was surprised by an unexpected visit. Margaret Reynolds arrived unannounced, carrying a folder of documents and wearing the determined expression Jessica knew well, the same one she saw in the mirror when about to do something important. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked, startled to find her at the front door. "We need to talk," Margaret replied, stepping inside and greeting Frank Miller with a brief nod. All three of us. Seated at the kitchen table, Margaret opened the folder and spread out several documents. "I've been investigating Horizon Development on my own," she began, to Jessica's astonishment, "and I found some things I think you both should know." "You're helping me with the case?" Jessica asked, disbelieving. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "Let's just say I'm trying to fix some past mistakes. And besides, no one messes with my daughter's career and gets away with it." The documents Margaret brought revealed that the development company had attempted to bribe public officials to speed up approvals and had falsified part of the environmental impact study. "How did you get this?" Jessica asked, impressed by the quality of the evidence. "I have my connections," Margaret replied cryptically. 30 years in the legal field has its perks." Frank watched the interaction between mother and daughter with a quiet smile, noticing the many similarities he'd never seen before. The determination, the sharp intelligence, the fierce loyalty when protecting what they loved. "This changes everything in the case," Jessica concluded after reviewing the documents. "With this evidence, we can not only win, but possibly file a lawsuit against the company." "That's exactly what I thought," Margaret agreed. "And there's one more thing." She pulled out one last document from the folder. "What is this?" Jessica asked. "An offer to become a legal consultant at my firm," Margaret replied. "Not as an employee, but as an independent associate. You'd keep your own practice here but have access to New York City resources and contacts when needed." Jessica looked at her mother, then at Frank, trying to process the unexpected offer. "Why would you do this, after everything that happened?" Margaret took a deep breath before answering. "Because you're my daughter, and I'm proud of the lawyer you've become, and because—" She hesitated briefly. "I realized I spent too much time worrying about appearances and traditions, and not enough recognizing what truly matters." Frank, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "It's a great opportunity, Jessica. You wouldn't have to choose between your new life and your career." The three talked late into the night, planning strategies for the case and discussing possibilities for the future. When Margaret finally prepared to leave, she did something that surprised everyone. She invited Frank to visit New York City. "There's so much about our daughter's life you should know," she said, an uncharacteristic softness in her voice. "And maybe we have more stories to share than just hers." Frank accepted the invitation with a shy smile, and Jessica watched, them both with a sense of hope she never imagined feeling just weeks before. As autumn progressed, Jessica's life found a new balance. Dividing her time between Sacramento and Hope Farmstead, she quickly built a reputation as a fierce advocate for small rural landowners. The case against the development company took an unexpected turn when the evidence presented by Margaret led the district attorney's office to open an investigation. Feeling the pressure mounting, the company executives finally proposed a settlement. They're offering to completely abandon the project and pay compensation for emotional damages, Jessica explained to Frank after a meeting with the company's lawyers. "In return, we wouldn't pursue the corruption evidence further." "What do you think we should do?" he asked, trusting his daughter's judgment completely. Jessica thought for a moment. "I think we should accept. A drawn-out lawsuit would be exhausting, and the compensation could be used to improve the farmstead." "The money doesn't matter to me," Frank replied honestly. "It never did." "I know," Jessica smiled, "but think of it as an acknowledgement of their wrongdoing, not just compensation. Besides," she hesitated, unsure whether to share the thought that had been on her mind for weeks. "Besides," Frank encouraged, "I've been thinking maybe I could build a small house here, on the higher part of the land overlooking the magnolias, for when I visit or maybe stay for longer periods." Frank's face lit up with a smile that erased years from his expression. "That would be wonderful, my daughter." The word daughter, which once felt so strange, now sounded natural between them. It was as if nature was correcting an anomaly, restoring a connection that should never have been broken. On a particularly pleasant September afternoon, while the last magnolias still displayed a few purple blooms, Jessica received an unexpected visitor at her office in Sacramento. Margaret, elegant as ever but with a more relaxed expression than Jessica remembered seeing, carried a package wrapped in delicate paper. "A gift," she explained, handing it over. "I thought it was time." Inside the box, Jessica found the crescent-shaped locket her mother had always kept so carefully. "It's just like the one," she began. "Frank's?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "They're actually two halves of the same locket. We bought them together at a craft fair that summer. Each of us kept one half." Jessica examined the locket with fresh eyes, realizing it truly seemed like part of a whole. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Margaret smiled, a genuine, serene smile Jessica rarely saw. "Because I think it's time for the two halves to come together again, as they should have from the start." Jessica understood the underlying message, in her mother's words. "You still have feelings for him," she observed, not as an accusation but as a realization. Margaret neither confirmed nor denied, but the faint blush on her cheeks was answer enough. "Life is too short for regrets, Jessica. I learned that watching you rebuild your life these past weeks. Your courage inspired me." That evening, Jessica took the locket to Hope Farmstead, where Frank waited to have dinner with her. When she showed him Margaret's gift, she saw tears in the eyes of the man she had learned to call father. "I never thought I'd see this again," he said, pulling his own half from his pocket, the one he always carried with him. Together, the two halves formed a perfect circle, with the complete image of a tree engraved in the metal. "A magnolia," Jessica realized, smiling at the symbolism. "That's what inspired the tradition," Frank confirmed. "Your mother loved the symbolism, a tree that remains discreet most of the year, but when it blooms, its beauty is impossible to ignore." Jessica felt a wave of emotion as she saw the two halves finally reunited, like a metaphor for her own fractured family that, against all odds, was finding its way back together. "I think we should invite Mom for dinner here next weekend," she suggested, trying to sound casual, "to celebrate settling the case and just spending time together." The hopeful smile on Frank's face was all the answer she needed. In the following weeks, something extraordinary began to happen. Margaret, who had always been so urban and sophisticated, started visiting the farmstead more and more frequently. At first with excuses about the case or to see Jessica, but it soon became clear there was something more. Frank, in turn, overcame his initial discomfort with the city and began occasionally visiting New York City, always staying at Jessica's apartment, but spending long hours talking with Margaret. It was as if they were both trying to reclaim not just the lost time with their daughter, but also rediscover what they had once felt for each other so many years ago. The small house Jessica had planned to build on the farmstead began taking shape, simple yet comfortable, with a wide porch facing the magnolias and enough space for visitors. To everyone's surprise, it was Margaret who became most involved in the project, suggesting details and features that made the space warm and practical. "I never pictured you interested in rustic decor, Mom," Jessica remarked as she watched Margaret personally selecting furniture for the porch. "There are many sides of me you don't know, dear," she replied with an enigmatic smile. "Perhaps because I suppressed them for so long myself." As the year drew to a close, something extraordinary was happening to all of them. Jessica, always so career-driven that she neglected personal relationships, found a harmony she'd never imagined possible between work and family. Frank, who had resigned himself to a solitary life, now found himself at the heart of a family growing stronger by the day. And Margaret, always so controlled and focused on appearances, finally allowed herself to feel emotions she'd repressed for decades. One starry December night, with Jessica's new house finally complete, the three of them sat on the porch, gazing at the distant magnolias, no longer in bloom, but majestic in their quiet beauty. "I was thinking," Frank began with a shyness reminiscent of the young man he'd been 3 decades earlier. "Next February, I'll plant the 36th magnolia. I'd like both of you to be here for it." Margaret looked at him with a soft smile. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." Jessica watched them, noticing the look they exchanged, no longer filled with bitterness or regret, but with deep understanding and possibility. "Actually," she continued, deciding it was the perfect moment to share the news she'd kept for weeks, "I was thinking we could plant 2 magnolias this time. They both turned to her, confused. "Two?" Frank asked. Jessica smiled, instinctively placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "One for my 36th birthday, and another for the baby arriving in September." The silence that followed was quickly replaced by joyful exclamations and tears. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly, while Frank seemed momentarily frozen by emotion. "I'm going to be a grandfather," he managed to say, his voice thick. "Yes," Jessica confirmed, smiling through her own tears. "And Mom's going to be a grandmother." "And who is—" Margaret began, her maternal curiosity surfacing. "Michael, the lawyer who helped me with my recent cases," explained Jessica, blushing slightly. "We've been together for a few months. He wanted to come with me today to meet you both officially, but I thought this news would be better shared first, among just the three of us." Frank stepped closer and, with surprising gentleness for his work-worn hands, touched Jessica's belly. "Another magnolia for our row," he said, moved. "Not just another," Jessica corrected, "the first of a new generation." As the sky darkened and stars multiplied above them, the three remained on the porch, talking about the future with a freedom none of them had imagined possible a year before. Margaret, sitting comfortably beside Frank, seemed finally at peace with herself. Jessica, watching them, understood that sometimes fate chooses winding paths to lead us exactly where we're meant to be. The courtroom that had once been a stage for confrontation and painful revelations now seemed only the beginning of a much greater journey, one of reconciliation, discovery, and above all, a family that, against all odds, had finally found its wholeness. When Michael was officially introduced to Frank and Margaret 2 weeks later, he found a family united by adversity and strengthened by a love that, though late, had proven stronger than time and circumstance. In the years that followed, the row of purple magnolias continued to grow, not just marking Jessica's birthdays, but also celebrating each new member who joined that improbably perfect family. The little house on the hill became the heart of family gatherings, laughter, and reconciliation. Margaret split her time between New York City and the farmstead more and more, until, to the surprise of many but not Jessica, she decided to accept Frank's marriage proposal, 37 years late, but no less sincere. The locket with the tree, now, reunited and displayed in a special frame in the main house's living room, served as a daily reminder that some stories, no matter how long they take, are destined for a happy ending. And Jessica, balancing her increasingly successful career as a rural rights lawyer with her life as a mother, daughter, and eventually a mentor to young attorneys, often reflected on how a single moment in that courtroom had changed everything. A moment when a simple rancher found the courage to reveal a truth hidden for decades, and an ambitious lawyer had the wisdom to realize that some causes are worth more than any professional victory. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us so much as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. On a sunny August afternoon, 5 years after that fateful courtroom meeting, the entire family gathered beneath the blooming magnolias to celebrate Margaret's birthday. The farmstead, now partly transformed into an environmental reserve with educational programs for local schools, had never looked more beautiful. Jessica watched her 4-year-old daughter, Lily, dart between the purple trees, chased by Grandpa Frank, who, despite his age, still had surprising vitality when it came to his granddaughter. "I never imagined my life would take this turn," Margaret remarked, walking up to her daughter with a tray of homemade lemonade. From a corporate lawyer in New York City to a farmstead lady in the countryside. Jessica smiled at her mother, noticing how much younger and more relaxed she seemed. "These past years, you look happier this way?" "I am," Margaret confirmed, watching fondly as her husband played with their granddaughter. "Who would have thought that all along what I truly wanted was right here, waiting patiently?" Michael joined them, carrying their youngest son, just a year old, in his arms. "Are you talking about the new project?" he asked, referring to the foundation Jessica and Margaret had recently created to offer free legal assistance to small farmers. "We were just reflecting on how life takes its turns," Jessica replied, cradling her young son in her arms. Margaret watched her daughter with her grandson, a sight that still moved her deeply. "I remember when you were that age," she remarked. "You had the same curious eyes, always observing everything around you. And now we have 2 new generations to keep watching the world," added Frank, stepping closer with Lily on his shoulders. "And new magnolias to plant every year." The row of trees, which had begun as a lone father's tribute to a daughter he couldn't know, now held additions for each new family member. A grove of memories, growing and blooming with every season. That evening, after the children had finally fallen asleep, following a day full of play, the 4 adults sat on the porch of the main house as they had so many times in recent years. "I got an interesting email today," Jessica mentioned, as they enjoyed a local wine Frank had started producing as a hobby. "From Horizon Development." Margaret and Frank exchanged surprised glances. What could they want after all this time? Asked Michael, who knew the story well, having entered Jessica's life during the lawsuit against the company. "They're selling the subsidiary that operated in this region," she explained. "And believe it or not, they wanted to know if we'd be interested in acquiring that land they plan to develop, adjacent to our property." Frank raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "And what did you say?" Jessica smiled with that familiar expression, the one she wore when she had a particularly brilliant strategy in mind. "I said we might be interested depending on the price and conditions. I've been thinking, what if we expanded the reserve project? That land has important springs." Margaret nodded, immediately grasping her daughter's vision. "We could create an ecological sanctuary, something that would remain untouched for future generations. A legacy," Frank added, moved by the idea. "Bigger than I ever dreamed of leaving." "And we could plant more magnolias," Jessica finished, smiling. "Not just to mark our anniversaries, but to celebrate every important family milestone." As they eagerly discussed the project's details, Jessica studied their faces, softly lit by the moonlight. Her family, brought together against all odds. A circle that had once been broken, with halves separated by miles and decades, now stood complete and stronger than ever. Gazing at the distant row of magnolias, dark silhouettes against the starry sky, Jessica recalled the words her father had written in one of those never-sent letters. "Some trees take time to bloom, but when they do, it's a spectacle worth the wait." Like those trees, her family had taken time to reach full bloom, but now that they finally had, it was truly a spectacle worth every moment of waiting. End of story. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever had a family revelation that changed your life? Leave a like and subscribe for more moving and transformative stories.